The last morning of the old Duke's clear speech. The great house at Ravensmere held its breath, and Marianne Cole held the spoon. She had learned the shape of his hands by then, the way the knuckles had gone to knots, the way the right one trembled worse than the left when the light came gray through the tall windows. She fed him the thin gruel a spoonful at a time, and she counted, because counting kept her steady, and steadiness was the only gift she had left to give a man. The rest of the household had already begun to bury. The fire snapped in the grate. Somewhere below, a door closed too softly to be innocent. And the Duke of Ravensmere, who had once ridden to hounds across 3 counties and signed his name at the bottom of Acts of Parliament, looked up at the plain woman spooning gruel into his mouth and said the thing she would carry for the rest of her life. He said it was not the illness. He said someone was doing this to him a little at a time, and that no one would believe a dying man. Then his eyes went cloudy again, and the words dissolved back into the long gray country he had begun to live in, and Marianne sat very still with the spoon in her hand and the fire snapping and the whole vast house pressing down on her like a held breath. She was 25. She had been 3 months in that house, and she did not yet know that the man's warning would cost her everything she had, or that it would eventually give her back a life she had stopped daring to want. Stay with her a moment. What follows is a quiet story, but it does not stay quiet, and the woman at the center of it deserves to be seen. She is about to be told, again and again, that she is no one. Watch what she does with it. Marianne had come to Ravensmere in the wet end of that autumn, with 1 trunk and a letter of character, and the particular composure of a woman who has learned to expect very little. Her father had been a country physician of modest practice and immoderate kindness, a man who forgave his poorer patients their bills and left his only daughter, at his death, a shelf of medical books and a mountain of debt. There had been no season for Marianne, no debut, no dancing. There had been a sick room, then a funeral, then the slow arithmetic of a house sold to strangers. When the position at Ravensmere was offered through her father's old correspondent, companion, and attendant to the ailing Duke, she had taken it the way a person takes the last dry stone across a flooded ford. She had packed the trunk herself, folding her 3 plain gowns over the shelf of her father's books so the corners would not chafe, wrapping his lancet case and his brass scales in a shawl. She no longer wore. The coach had set her down at the lodge gate in a fine cold rain, and she had walked the last half-mile up the avenue with her hem darkening to the knee, and the great grey house of Ravensmere had risen at the end of the drive, like a thing that had been standing since before her grandmother's grandmother, and would go on standing long after everyone now. Inside it was dust. She had stood a moment at the foot of it and made herself breathe. Then she had gone in at the servant's door because that was the door for a woman with 1 trunk, and no one had come to meet her but a footman with a candle, and instructions to show her to a room 3 flights up and colder than the rain outside. The house did not want her. She understood that within a day. The servants were civil in the way that is a kind of wall, and the family, what remained of it, regarded her as one regards a piece of hired furniture placed in a room without consultation. To the household she was the nurse. That was all. The nurse, they said, as though the word settled the matter of her entirely, as though a woman who tended the dying could have no other dimension, no father remembered, no mind of her own. She had expected that. What she had not expected was the Duke himself. He was 80 years old and failing, and on his good afternoons he was the most interesting person Marianne had spoken to in years. He had read everything. He remembered the coronation of a king, 3 monarchs gone. He asked her about her father's books, and when she answered him honestly, without the flattering hesitation the household used, something in his ruined face settled, as though he had been waiting a long time for a plain answer plainly given. She read to him from the Latin he could no longer hold steady before his eyes. She learned the exact degree of warmth he liked, the fire, and the psalm he asked for when the nights were bad, and the way he pressed a dried sprig of rue between the pages of his prayer book and would not say why. And she learned slowly that his good afternoons were becoming rarer, and that the pattern of their coming and going made no sense that any book of her father's could explain. That was the first thread, and she did not yet know It was a thread. She only knew that a strong constitution does not usually fail in the particular rhythm the Duke's was failing. Better, after a fortnight in the country air of the East Wing. Worse within days of returning to the tonics the family physician left in their neat blue bottles. She noticed she was her father's daughter. And she could not help but notice. She said nothing, because she was the nurse, and the nurse did not question the physician. And a woman with one trunk and a letter of character did not question anyone at all. The house had a mistress, and her name was Lady Cassandra Ashby, and she was not the Duke's daughter, but his son's widow, which is to say she was the stepmother of the man who would one day be Lord of Ravensmere, and she wore that ambiguous rank like a blade she had learned to keep sheathed. Lady Cassandra was still handsome at 40, dark and precise, with a way of entering a room that rearranged it. She had married the Duke's only son late, buried him within 4 years, and remained at Ravensmere on the strength of a jointure and a will that everyone spoke of in lowered voices. She managed the household accounts. She engaged and dismissed the servants. She received the family physician in her own morning room and conferred with him behind a closed door. And it was from her hand, Marianne came slowly to understand, that the neat blue bottles were carried up to the Duke's chamber. She was unfailingly gracious to Marianne, which was somehow worse than rudeness. She called her a treasure. She called her a comfort. She said once at the foot of the great stair with 2 footmen listening that it was such a mercy to have found a girl of the serving sort who could read, and she said it smiling, and the smile did not reach anywhere near her eyes. The girl of the serving sort curtsied and said she was glad to be of use, and went up the stairs with her face composed and her hands inside her plain gray sleeves, curled into fists she did not permit anyone to see. There was a grandson. This mattered more than Marianne allowed herself to consider in those first weeks, because considering it led nowhere a woman of her station was permitted to go. Julian Ashby, Earl of Wexholm, was the Duke's grandson through the dead son, and the heir to everything, and he had been abroad with his regiment for the better part of 3 years. The household spoke of him rarely and carefully. He had quarreled with someone before he left, though no one would say with whom. And he had not come home for his father's funeral. And Lady Cassandra spoke his name in the particular even tone people use for a subject they have decided to control. When word came that the Earl was returning to Ravensmere at last, called home by the news of his grandfather's decline, the house changed the way a room changes when a window is opened onto winter. He arrived on a gray afternoon in a travel-stained coat, and Marianne saw him first from the gallery above the hall. A tall man standing very still in the center of all that motion, letting the servants take his gloves and his hat, and asking, in a low voice that carried anyway, to be taken up to his grandfather at once, not to be shown his rooms, not to take refreshment, up to his grandfather at once. Lady Cassandra descended the stair to meet him with both hands extended and every appearance of joy, and the Earl of Wexholm took her hands because he could not do otherwise. And over her shoulder his eyes went up to the gallery and found the plain woman standing there, and stopped. It was nothing. It was a half a second. Marianne told herself it was nothing 100 times that night and did not believe herself even once. He had looked at her, the way her father used to look at a symptom that did not fit the diagnosis, not with interest in her, she was certain, but with the sudden alertness of a man who has just been given a piece that will not go into the puzzle he was handed at the door. He came to the sick room that evening, and he did not leave for a long time. Marianne rose to withdraw, as was proper, and the Earl said, without turning, that she should stay. His grandfather knew her, he said. His grandfather was easier with her in the room. It was the first command he ever gave her, and like every command he would give her afterward, it was dressed as an order and shaped, underneath, like a shelter. She stayed. She stood by the window while the tall, grave man sat by the bed and held the old man's ruined hand, and she watched the Duke surface, for a moment, into one of his rare afternoons of clarity, and she watched him look at his grandson and begin, urgently, to try to say the thing he had said to her. He got out 3 words before the fog took him. Someone. Little. Believe. The Earl leaned close, his whole frame gone rigid with the effort of listening, and got no more. Yet he had heard the shape of it. Marianne saw him hear it. And when he straightened at last and turned, his face had the stillness of stone laid over something moving underneath, and he looked at her across the dim room and asked her a question no one else in that house had thought to ask. He asked her what she had seen. She should have said nothing. A woman in her place, with one trunk and a letter of character, says she has seen nothing. That his grace wanders, that the illness is only the illness. She opened her mouth to say it, and then she looked at the old man, who had asked her about her father's books, who had waited so long for a plain answer plainly given, and she found she could not sell him for her own safety after all. She told the Earl about the pattern, the better fortnights in the East Wing, the worst days after the blue bottles. She told it plainly, without accusation, laying the observations side by side the way her father had taught her to lay out symptoms, and she watched the Earl of Wexholm grow very still and very pale, and she understood that she had just stepped off the last dry stone into the flood. You feel it too, do you not? The moment a person decides to tell the truth in a house built to swallow it. Hold on to that. She is going to need it. And so is he. What Marianne could not know, that first night, was the shape of the wound the Earl carried into that sick room, though she would come to understand it in the weeks that followed, in fragments, the way one learns the truth of a proud and private man. 3 years before, Julian Ashby had quarreled with his grandfather over precisely this woman, Lady Cassandra, whom the young Earl had distrusted from the moment his father brought her home. He had said so plainly to the old Duke, and the old Duke, who loved his son and wished him happy, had told his grandson he saw shadows where there were none, had called his suspicion an unkindness, had sent him from the room. And Julian, too proud to plead and too angry to stay, had taken a commission abroad and let 3 years of silence stand between himself and the last of his blood. His father had died in that silence. No, his grandfather was dying in it too, and the thing Julian had named a shadow 3 years gone was standing at the foot of the stair with both hands extended, smiling. He had come home to a grief he had helped to make, and the plain woman in the gray gown had just told him that the shadow had been real all along, and that he had been right, and that being right had cost the old man upstairs 3 years he would never get back. A lesser man might have hated her for the telling. The Earl of Wexholm, Marianne came to see, was made otherwise. The knowledge did not soften him, it set him the way mortar sets. And from that night forward he was in the sick room every day, and he took a sudden interest in the household accounts that made Lady Cassandra's smile grow thin at the edges, and he began, quietly, to ask questions in the village. He rode down himself, in the mornings without a groom, and Marianne would see him go from the gallery window, the tall dark figure and the tall dark horse against the bare autumn hedges, and see him return at noon with his face gone stiller than before. He spoke to the vicar. He spoke to the old woman who had kept the still room in his grandmother's day and been turned off. Without a pension, the year Lady Cassandra took the household in hand. He spoke most carefully of all to the apothecary, a nervous small man who did not like the questions and liked the Earl's face while he asked them even less. What Julian gathered on those cold rides he did not share with the house. He carried it up to the sick room and set it, piece by piece, beside the pattern the nurse had given him, and the 2 men, the young and the very old, built the shape of the truth between them in the hours when the fog let the Duke speak. Marianne watched it happen and told herself it had nothing to do with her. He was not staying near the sick room for her sake. He required her because she was a witness, because she knew the pattern, because her father's book sat on the shelf in her small room, and she could read a physician's Latin and tell him what the neat blue bottles were likely to contain. That was all. She told herself that with great firmness, standing at the window while he sat by the bed, and her treacherous body, which had never learned to lie as well as her mouth had, marked the exact moment he entered any room she was in, every time, without her once turning to look. The house understood before she did. Servants always do. And the household's understanding of it took the only shape the household had room for, which was that the nurse had set her cap at the air, that the girl of the serving sort had ideas above her station, that a plain creature with one trunk had looked up at an earl and forgotten what she was. She heard it first from the housekeeper, Mrs. Poole, who was not unkind, but was afraid, and who caught Marianne's sleeve on the back stairs and told her, low and quick, to have a care. The Earl was grieving and grateful. Mrs. Poole said, and grief and gratitude in a great man could look like something warmer than they were. And a girl who mistook the one for the other would find herself dismissed without a character, and no one to blame but her own vanity. It was said as a kindness. It landed like a slap. Marianne thanked her and went up to the sick room and stood a little further from the window than she had the day before. The trouble was the Duke's good afternoons, which had begun since the Earl's return and the quiet cessation of the blue bottles, to come more often. He was not recovering. He was too old and too far gone for that, and the damage of the long, slow months could not be undone. Even so, the fog lifted more frequently now, and in those hours he was himself, and he used them. He spoke to his grandson of the estate and the tenants, and the things a lord must hold in trust. He asked Marianne to fetch his prayer book, and pressed the dried sprig of rue and would not say why. And then, one clear grey afternoon with the fire snapping, and both of them by his bed, he said why. The rue had been his wife's, he told them. She had grown it in the physic garden below the east wing, for the kitchen and the still room, in the years when Ravensmere had a mistress who walked, in the mornings, among the herbs. He had kept the sprig since her death because it smelled of her hands. And he had learned this past terrible year, in the long grey country of his illness, to be glad she had not lived to see what her garden had become, because someone, he said, was using it. Someone who knew the old still-room receipts, who knew which of the pretty green things in a lady's herb bed will thin the blood and cloud the mind, and stop a heart by the slow accumulation of very little over a very long time, so that a strong old man's death looks like nothing but the ordinary courtesy of age. He did not say her name. He was too shrewd even then to say a name he could not prove. Yet he looked at the doorway when he said it, and the doorway was where Lady Cassandra Ashby stood at that exact moment, having come up unannounced on her soft, careful feet, and the three of them turned and saw her there, and no one in the room pretended anything. Lady Cassandra smiled, and said she had come to see whether his Grace wanted anything, and that it grieved her to hear him so fanciful, and that the mind at the end was a sad and wandering thing. She said it gently. She said it for the Earl's benefit, and for the benefit of the footman on the landing behind her, laying down already, in that soft, grieving voice, the story the house would be asked to believe. Then she withdrew, and her withdrawal was the withdrawal of a general who has seen the ground, and does not like it, and means to choose better next time. That night the Earl found Marianne in the library, where she had gone to return a volume, and he did not stand at a proper distance, and neither did she. He told her he had written to a physician in London, a man of reputation who owed him a favor, and asked him to come and examine his grandfather, and the bottles both. He told her he had ridden to the apothecary in the village, and learned who had been buying certain things, and in what quantities, over the past 2 years, and the name in the apothecary's book was not the name anyone in the house would say aloud. He laid it out for her the way she had laid the pattern out for him that first night, one hard fact beside another, and she understood that he was not telling her because she was a witness now. He was telling her because she was the only person under that roof he trusted, and there is a kind of intimacy in being trusted that is harder to bear than tenderness, and she bore it standing very still, with a book pressed to her chest like a shield. He said her name then, not Miss Cole, which was how he had addressed her for weeks. He said Marianne once, quietly, as though testing the weight of it, and the sound of her own name in his low voice went through her like the first warmth after cold, and she looked up at him and forgot, for a whole and dangerous moment, every single thing that she was. She stepped back first. She always would. She said in a voice she kept steady by main force, that he should not, that the house was watching, that she had a great deal to lose, and he had nothing, and that a kindness that ruined her was no kindness at all. It was the honest thing, the difficult thing, the one sentence she had not let herself say. The Earl of Wexholm heard it, and the muscle in his jaw stood out hard, and he did not reach for her, though she saw, in the set of his hand at his side, exactly how much the not reaching cost him. He said only that he understood, and that she was right, and that he would not make her pay for his gratitude. And then he said one thing more, low, not quite a promise, that when this was finished and the truth of it stood in the open, he would come and speak to her again, and she might say to him then, whatever she truly wished, with nothing to lose by the saying. She did not answer. She could not. She went up to her small, cold room and sat on the edge of the bed with her heart going like a hammer, and understood that she had just been handed the one thing she had taught herself never to want, and that it would be taken from her, because things always were, and that she must not let herself believe in it for even one night. The blow, when it came the way she had known it would, through the ground she could not defend. Lady Cassandra did not accuse Marianne of setting her cap at the Earl. That was the servant's story, and too small for her purpose. What Lady Cassandra did, 3 days later, with the household assembled below and the London physician not yet arrived, was far more elegant and very nearly fatal. She stood in the great hall and said, with tears in her eyes and grief in her lovely voice, that she had discovered the most dreadful thing, that certain items were missing from the still room and the medicine chest, that the poor Duke had been slowly failing under someone's hand these 2 years past, and that the person with the knowledge to do it, the person with a physician father, and a shelf of medical books and unsupervised access to his Grace's food and drink at every hour of the day and night, was the nurse. The nurse. Close quote. Voiced for the 3rd time in the great hall, before the assembled house. And this time, it was not a dismissal. This time, it was a noose. She had the apothecary's purchases, turned to point at Marianne, who had walked to the village on errands and could be said to have gone in. She had the medical books that were the whole of Marianne's inheritance turned into instruments of guilt. She had the servant's resentment of the plain outsider ready to hand and needing only a direction. And she wept while she did it, wept beautifully, a woman betrayed by the very creature she had charitably taken in, and Marianne stood in the center of that turning circle of faces and felt the floor of her whole small life give way beneath her. This is the low place. Do not look away from it. She had told the truth in a house built to swallow truth, and the house had opened its mouth. The Earl was not there. That was the cruelty of the timing, precisely chosen. He had ridden out that morning to meet the London physician on the road, and Lady Cassandra had struck in the hour of his absence, so that when he returned, it would be to a settled thing, a household already certain, a nurse already locked in the stone room off the old buttery to await the magistrate, the story already hardening into the only shape the house would afterward remember. Marianne did not weep in the buttery room. She sat on the cold bench with her hands folded and did the only thing she knew how to do, which was to think clearly the way her father had taught her, laying the facts side by side. The room was scarcely more than a stone cell, a barred window high in the wall, a smell of old cider and damp lime, a single tallow candle the footman had left her. Out of a pity he was ashamed to show. She did not rage at the barred door. Rage was a luxury, and she had never been able to afford luxuries. Instead, she went back over every day of her 3 months in the house, the way her father would go back over a patient's history when the fever made no sense, asking not what had happened, but what did not fit. The accusation was clever. It fit the servant's resentment, it fit her books, it fit her freedom of the sick room, it fit everything, except the one fact no one in that hall had thought to weigh. And in the laying of it side by side with the rest, she found, at the very bottom of her despair, one hard, bright thing that Lady Cassandra, for all her elegance, had not accounted for: the roué. The dried sprig in the Duke's prayer book, pressed there by an old man's hand, that he had told them came from his dead wife's physic garden below the east wing. The physic garden that Lady Cassandra had used, because she knew the old still-room receipts, because she alone in that house had the knowledge of a lady raised to manage herbs in still-rooms and had let it slip, that clear grey afternoon, that she knew exactly which pretty green things would thin the blood and cloud the mind. Marianne had never entered the physic garden in her life. She would not have known rue from parsley. The Duke, though, knew, and he had left a witness that did not depend on a dying man's word, if only someone would think to look, and gather what still grew there, and set it before eyes that could not be told the mind was wandering. When the Earl of Wexham returned at dusk with the London physician at his side, and found his grandfather's nurse locked in the buttery and a stepmother composed and grieving in the drawing-room, he did not raise his voice. Marianne would hear afterward how still he had been, how terribly quiet, how he had listened to the whole beautiful accusation without moving a muscle of his face, and then had asked, in a level tone, only one question. He asked to be taken to his grandfather, and he asked that the household come, all of it, and the magistrate too, who had been sent for, and the London physician, and Lady Cassandra above all. He said there would be an accounting, and it would be done properly, in front of everyone, so that no one could ever say afterward that it had been done in a corner. He had the room where the verdict had been passed. He would have the room where it was overturned. They gathered in the Duke's chamber in the last light of that grey day, the great and the small of Ravensmere pressed against the walls, and the old man himself propped high on his pillows in one of his clear hours, watching with eyes that had gone sharp again, as though he had saved himself for this. The magistrate stood by the bed. The London physician set out the blue bottles he had already examined and said, in the flat, careful voice of a man who will swear to it in any court what they contained and in what amount, and that it was not a thing that entered a sick room by accident. And then the Earl of Wexham sent for Marianne. She came in with the buttery dust still on her grey gown and her head up, because she would not give the room the pleasure of a broken woman, and she carried in her hand the Duke's prayer book, open to the pressed sprig of rue. She did not defend herself with words. She had learned long ago that words were the cheapest thing in a great house, and the least believed from a woman of her station. Instead, she asked the London physician plainly whether he knew the herb pressed in the book. She asked whether it grew in the garden below the east wing. She asked who in that house had the knowledge to walk into a lady's physic garden and choose from among the pretty green things exactly the ones that would do this slow and particular work, and to know the still-room receipts by heart, and to weep about missing items while naming, with such precision, what those items could do. The room was silent, and into that silence Lady Cassandra made her single error, the error of a person whose script has worked everywhere except here, and said sharply before she could stop herself that the rue proved nothing, that anyone might press a common weed, that it was hyssop and not rue in any case, and signified nothing at all. The London physician looked at her for a long moment. Then he said quietly that it was rue, unmistakably rue, and that he had not named the herb aloud, and that he wondered how her ladyship had known which weed they were discussing before ever she had looked at the page. It was very quiet in the room after that. Marianne watched the certainty go out of Lady Cassandra's face the way water goes out of a cracked vessel, all at once and without noise, and she felt no triumph, only a great and shaking weariness, and something underneath it that she did not yet have a name for. The magistrate began to speak. The servants who had turned their faces from her that morning could not now meet her eyes. And the old Duke, propped high on his pillows, looked at the woman his son had married, with an expression of terrible final sorrow, and said, in a voice that carried to every corner of the room, that he had known, and that he had said so once to a grandson he had wronged for the saying, and that he asked, before them all, that the wrong be set right. The Earl of Wexham crossed the room. He did not cross it to his stepmother. He crossed it to the plain woman in the dust-stained gown, standing alone in the center of all those faces, and he stopped before her, and in front of the magistrate and the physician, and the whole assembled house and his dying grandfather's clear and watching eyes, he took her hand. He said it was Miss Cole who saved my grandfather's name. 12 words, no more, spoken, level and clear, in the very room where another voice had tried to hang her that morning. He did not make a speech. He did not crush his stepmother with cruelty. The law would do what the law did, and he left it to the law, and turned his back on her displacement as a thing already finished. He said only that one thing, claiming her worth in the sight of everyone who had denied it, and he held her hand while he said it, and did not let go. Marianne stood with her hand in his and her father's books, vindicated, and the old man weeping quietly on his pillows, and she understood that the truth had, after all, been believed, and that it had been believed because a man had crossed a room to stand where she stood, and she found that she was weeping too, at last, now that it was safe. The old Duke of Ravensmere lived until the first snow. They were good weeks. Those last ones, the best he had known in 2 years. With the blue bottles gone, and the fear gone with them, his clear afternoons stretched long, and he spent them as a man spends coin he has just learned he still possesses. He had his grandson home and reconciled, the 3 lost years spoken of once, and then forgiven and not raised again. He had Marianne read to him from the Latin, and he teased her in his dry old way, that she read it better than the tutor who had once beaten it into him. He asked for the psalm he had always asked for on the bad nights, and now asked for it on the good ones too, for the pleasure of it rather than the fear. He had the fire built up high the way he liked it, and sat watching the flames with his grandson beside him, and the plain woman he had learned to trust across the hearth. And once, when the snow began, he said that a man could do worse than end his days in a warm room, among people who told him the truth. And he had the satisfaction, rare in any life, of having been believed before the end. Lady Cassandra was gone from the house by then, removed to the keeping of the law, and the slower keeping of a family who would not have her back, and Ravensmere did not speak of her, and the physic garden below the east wing was dug over and planted new in the spring, the pretty poisonous things pulled up by the roots. The Earl came to Marianne, as he had said he would when it was finished, and the truth of it stood in the open. He came on a still afternoon with snow beginning to fall past the tall windows, and he did not command her to stay this time, and he did not stand at a careful distance. He said that the house was no longer watching in the way it had, that she had nothing left to lose by the saying, and that he was asking her now. Plainly, as a man asks, and not as an earl commands whether she would consent to remain at Ravensmere. Not as the nurse. He said the word and then set it down between them for the last time, gently, the way one sets down a thing one means never to pick up again. Not as the nurse, he said. As his wife, if she would have him. As the mistress of the house that had tried to break her. Marianne Cole, who had come to that house with one trunk and a letter of character, and the composure of a woman who expected very little, looked up at the tall, grave man who had crossed a room for her, and found that the thing she had taught herself never to want was standing in front of her, asking, and that she was, after all, permitted to say yes. She said yes. The old Duke saw them wed before the snow closed the roads, a small ceremony in the family chapel with the household gathered, the same faces that had turned from her once, now turned toward her and glad, in the way of people who are relieved to have been shown they were wrong. He gave the bride away himself, from a chair, by the altar too frail to stand, but not too frail for this. And when it was done, he pressed into Marianne's hand the small worn prayer book, with the sprig of rue still inside it, and told her to keep it, because a thing that had told the truth once should be kept by someone who valued the truth, and there was no one in the world he trusted with it more. He died 3 weeks later, in his sleep, in one of the clear, untroubled hours, with his grandson on one side of the bed and his grandson's wife on the other, and the fire snapping in the grate the way it had on the morning he first told her that someone was doing this to him, and no one would believe a dying man. Someone had believed him. In the end, someone had. That spring, the new mistress of Ravensmere walked in the mornings among the herbs of the replanted garden, the way the old Duke's wife had walked before her, and the house that had called her the nurse learned to call her my lady, and meant it. She kept the prayer book on the table by her bed, and on the worst nights when the wind came off the moor and the old house creaked in its bones, she would open it to the pressed sprig of rue and hold it a moment in the candlelight, and remember the frail hand that had put it there, and the man who had crossed the room, and the plain, unlikely truth that worth, however long the world declines to see it, is sometimes seen at last. If Marianne's stories stayed with you, stay a moment yourself, and let it settle. Some stories are only worth telling because someone was finally believed.